Our next speaker, I'm just going to let Dr. Simpkins stand up. I'll do it from here. Our next speaker is Dr. Simpkins. I've worked with Dr. Simpkins for years. He's an incredible intensive care medicine doctor and trauma surgeon in Alexandria, Louisiana. Currently, he is the President and Chief Innovation Officer of, I can't even say it, Vivacella, is that right? Vivacello?
That's fine.
He'll say it, Bio Incorporated, and he's here to talk to us about a very unique resuscitative fluid, something I found extremely fascinating. Dr. Simpkins.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for inviting me, and I'd like to tell the audience that I'm glad to see you, because it being Saturday and being the last lecture on the last day, I figured I had to get my relatives here to have an audience, but you're here, and I'm glad you're here. Thank you for being here. I want to talk to you, first let me talk to you about our team. So is there a pointer here or something? No. Okay. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer of our startup, biotechnology startup. Juan Rodriguez is a physicist who works with us. Krista Tulleri is our Chief Medical Officer. She's a regulatory person. And Mallory Williams is the Chief of Trauma Surgery at Howard University, also on our Scientific Advisory Board. I'd just like to give them credit for a lot of the material that I'm going to present to you. In terms of full disclosure, I'm the Chief Innovation Officer, President, Chairman of the Board of Vivacell Bio, the biotech company that my wife Diane and she's right there. Would you stand up, darling? Okay. I couldn't not do it without her permission and without her help. I'm also a shareholder of Vivacell Bio. I've been granted 9 U.S. patents for this technology, 25 patents in international jurisdictions, and I've assigned those patents to Vivacell Bio. You can go to our website for more information, and for a small fee, I'll give you some DNA too for full disclosure if you need that too, or fingerprints. So this is what I'm about. I'm a trauma surgeon, and I have patients like her. I remember a 17-year-old girl who was going to the store, to the mall, to get some things for her prom. She was a passenger. Suddenly someone crossed over the lane and hit her car head on. That driver died. The driver of the car she was in was badly injured, and she looked great. She was walking around and talking. So the ER brought her in and didn't follow the trauma protocol, which was to call us, thought she looked good, let her stay there, and all of a sudden they called me and tell me she was in cardiac arrest. I opened her chest, massaged her hard, told my residents to give blood and fluid and so forth. We got a good blood pressure back and took her to the operating room. She had an injury that we could have fixed pretty readily had we been called like we were supposed to be called. It was a laceration of the aorta. I can't give you her name or anything. This would be a HIPAA violation. But we fixed the injury, but we couldn't get her blood pressure up. We couldn't get her heart working properly. We stayed up the whole night. And then the worst thing, I had to tell her mother that we couldn't save her. So something's wrong. When we can fix the surgical injuries, we can fix the hole in the heart, we can fix the hole in the laceration in the aorta or in the liver, we can give them blood, and they still die. So let's look at the current therapy, the acute therapy of hemorrhagic shock. We have class 1, class 2, class 3, and class 4, and it goes by how much blood you lose. The higher the class, the more blood is lost. So down at the bottom, you see crystalloid, fluid. There's crystalloid for class 1, class 2, there's more crystalloid, but when you lose 30% of your blood volume at 1,500 to 2,000 cc's, you've got to give blood because crystalloid is inadequate. But I had to think about hemorrhagic shock. What happens with blood? There are neutrophils in blood which attack your endothelial cells. Platelets get activated and release mediators that are harmful. You have complement activation. You have enhanced reactive oxygen species. You don't modulate nitric oxide that's overproduced. You have free hemoglobin that's released and just rips up the kidneys. You have multi-system organ failure as a result of that. If any of us here in this room were to design something for shock, it would not be blood. Yet that's the best that we have. There are other problems with blood. It's not that available always. The shelf life is short, only 42 days. It carries disease. Therefore, it's expensive to acquire it. Dr. Joe did a landmark paper, and Dr. Jones did a landmark paper on the cost, making us realize the cost of blood, the actual cost of blood, is extremely expensive. $1,600 to $2,400 a unit of blood to make sure it's safe, to make sure it can be safely given, because it really isn't safe. So whoever designed blood didn't design it to keep you alive in shock. Whoever designed blood designed it as euthanasia, because all of the weapons are there in the blood to have you, put you out of your misery, basically, because you're badly injured. And we, with our technological advances, have superseded that, and we're able to get around that. But this is not what you would design. Blood is not the best thing. When it comes to contact with an ECMO circuit or any other circuit or a bypass circuit, there's an intense inflammatory response. This is a complicated diagram, but on the left-hand half, it's all about the things that are activated. Complement's activated. You have cytokine, interleukin-1, tumor necrosis factor, platelet activation, neutrophil activation, goes over to the other side, attacks the endothelium, which is also activated. The neutrophils go past the endothelium into the interstitium and cause incredible damage. So let's look at colloids. We have colloids. We don't want to use blood. Let's look at the heterostarches. The heterostarches have been black boxed by the FDA because of increased mortality, renal failure, and increased bleeding. That was a $6 billion market. That's falling apart now because the FDA has issued that black box problem. Albumin. If you give a lot of albumin, albumin has a very reactive thiol group in its chemistry, in its structure. And it increases pulmonary failure, renal failure, and it increases bleeding. Many people don't know that. But it enhances bleeding, not as badly as the heterostarches, but significantly. Also in traumatic brain injury, for some reason, there's increased mortality. Plasma increases pulmonary complications. It has complement in it. It's not designed for shock. There's low efficacy in raising the blood pressure. And is minimally protective over Ringer's lactate. It's not much better than Ringer's lactate in protecting tissue. And the supply is variable. So I had to rethink this whole thing. And I was driven by the fact that I had to tell someone's mother, someone's father, that we couldn't save them, even though we accomplished all of our therapeutic and surgical goals. We really couldn't. So think about it. You've all taken care of Jehovah's Witnesses with hemoglobins of 4 and 2, and the lowest I've seen reported is 1.5, surviving surgery. Do you really need all of that blood? How much of it do you need? You don't really know. There's some novel experiments performed by Pedro Cabrales at the University of California in San Diego. And what he did was he subjected mice to shock, to severe hemorrhagic shock. And then he infused, to resuscitate them, blood, or blood without oxygen, blood that was loaded with carbon monoxide, of all things. The animals that got the blood loaded with carbon monoxide had less organ damage than the ones that got regular blood. So how important is the oxygen? He did another experiment in which he changed the oxidation state of the hemoglobin so that it couldn't bind to oxygen at all. And he used that blood and compared it to regular blood, and those animals did just as well. So it's not, blood has components in it. It's got a wall, it's got hemoglobin. When we think of blood, we usually think about the hemoglobin and oxygen carrying capacity. But there are other things that blood does. It increases viscosity. It replaces the volume. And I remember a patient that I had, Jehovah's Witness, who had a massive MI, caused him to have a massive automobile accident. Both legs were crushed. His spleen was avulsed from his abdomen. His belly was full of blood. I did a tap, and it was old blood, so I decided to leave him alone, not to operate on him. Probably the best thing I did for him. Wouldn't take anything but factor 7. And his hemoglobin went to 2.8. So, but what we did for him, we always made sure he was euvolemic with a Swan-Ganz catheter, and we managed him that way. And he got out of, well, he lost that leg eventually, but he got out of the hospital. So volume, what Cabrales found was that viscosity and volume, maintenance of volume, is a critical factor. Those are critical factors. And oxygen is not, at least having a certain hemoglobin, is not as important as we think it is. Then I thought about, okay, I see that that really is viscosity, it's volume. Is it better to give whatever you give intravenously or intraarterially? If you give it intravenously, then the fluid has to go through the vena cava, the right atrium, the right ventricle, the pulmonary circulation, the left atrium, the left ventricle, and then the coronary arteries. If you give it intraarterially, it goes right to the coronary arteries where you want it to go, and to the brain. So it seemed to me that it might be better to give whatever you're going to give. In this case, we gave Ringer's lactate, just to make the point, to intraarterially rather than intravenous. So we tested that idea. In this experiment, we obtained mice, and I didn't really have any funding, so we used whatever mice we could find. Fortunately, at LSU, the veterinarians were very nice to me, and they gave me any mice. And I thought about that. You know, usually you want the same species of mouse. But I said, well, people aren't like that. I'll take any mouse. If I can catch them, I'll use that mouse. You know, any mouse. So we use any kind of mice. I don't know what species they were or anything. But just like people, it's a different, if this technology was going to work, then it wouldn't matter what kind of mouse it was. It wouldn't matter at all. And it was very, very interesting because we cannulated the carotid artery and the internal jugular vein of these mice. And we removed 55% of the blood volume within 3 minutes. If you did nothing, they'd be dead in 10 minutes, most of them within 3 minutes. And some of them, we infused Ringer's lactate in the same volume as the blood that was removed, either intravenously through the jugular or intraarterially. None of the mice that got intravenous resuscitation lived. Each one of the mice, every mouse that we gave the fluid to intraarterially, lived for variable amounts of time, from 165 minutes all the way down to 3 minutes. But we got some response. And that told me that intraarterial resuscitation is really what you want to do in hemorrhagic shock. And we can do that now with ultrasound. I do it all the time in putting in arterial lines. Okay, so then my other question was, when is dead dead? Now, you know, sometimes we declare someone dead, you got to turn the monitors off because electrical activity is continuing. Well, how long does the ventricle contract? When is dead dead? Just because you can't feel a pulse doesn't mean the heart has stopped. So I had a big problem. Like I said, I didn't have any research funding, so I was using whatever mice I could get, but I didn't have any way of really detecting cardiac contraction. So I opened the chest up and looked at it. And what we did, we found out that we did 3 mice initially. You see mouse 1, 2, and 3. T1 is the number of minutes that the ventricle contracted after the mouse was clinically dead. The mouse had stopped breathing, and then we opened the chest to see how long did the ventricles contract. And it got 18 minutes, 27 minutes, 25 minutes. And then we infused Ringer's lactate intravenously. Nothing happened. And then we infused it intraarterially, and we got restoration of ventricular contraction. Then we did more experiments with 8 mice injecting either intraarterially or intravenously. None of those other mice that got intravenous injection had any restoration of cardiac contractions. Each of the mice that got intraarterial contraction had restoration of their contractions for an average of 31 minutes. Then there were more questions. Is there better fluid than Ringer's lactate? Is there better fluid than blood? I won't go through the process, but it occurred to me that all cells are made of phospholipids, and that oxygen is more soluble in lipids than it is in water. Therefore, if we had phospholipids, if we had liposomes and micelles, then we would have something that could carry oxygen. And we did a calculation looking at the partition coefficient, and we could see that it could be enough oxygen, actually, to sustain a person. And that if we use these to do what Cabrales showed was necessary, that is, improve the viscosity, restore the volume, and other things, then this might be a better resuscitation fluid. And so what we found here, the thought was, well, let's go to the experiments later. What we thought was that we could quickly and persistently expand intravascular volume. Nitric oxide gets overproduced in shock. And so we thought we could absorb nitric oxide, but also get it released, because you don't want to take it away. You want it to be available at the same time. This would be easily metabolized, because after all, it's something that can be used as a source of energy. It could carry oxygen, because oxygen is better absorbed in lipids than it is in water. And so it should preferentially take up oxygen. And it would be safe, because these phospholipids are used by industry for everything. They're used by industry for other medications, for medications like propofol, for many, many, many other medications. I took the propofol out, took the hemoglobin out, took perfluorocarbons out, and just used, it's like using the box rather than using what's in the box. We took everything out of the box. All of our cells are made of phospholipids, and so we used that, and we took advantage of the biophysical properties of the container. And this is what we got. The top line, on the left axis you have blood pressure, and the x-axis, on the y-axis you have blood pressure, on the x-axis you have time. And what you have here is you have mice which had a large amount of blood removed, 55% of the blood volume removed. The pressure went down to 12. And like I said, they would be dead in 3 minutes. And the top line are the blood pressures that are achieved over 1 hour using a 300 nanometer nanoparticle, phospholipid nanoparticle. The bottom line is Ringer's lactate. The graph on the left is systolic pressure, and the graph on the right is diastolic pressure. And you can see that clearly the phospholipid worked very well. We looked at the lungs because we thought there might be some damage in the lungs. There was no damage in the lungs. These are the lungs on the left-hand side, this is 24 hours after resuscitation with shed blood. And on the right-hand side is 24 hours after resuscitation with the phospholipids. There was no damage to the lung. We looked at survival, and with one bolus of phospholipids, the survival was 218 minutes and 65 minutes for the Ringer's lactate. Then we looked at the animals after they were dead, after they were clinically dead. Remember that experiment I told you about where the heart's still beating after there's no blood pressure and after there's no breathing. So we let these mice die, and we oxygenated the phospholipids. And so we got restoration of signs of life after the mouse was dead. And it was an average in these 6 mice, average of 84 minutes that they survived with one bolus of phospholipids, and the blood pressures went up to a 86/60 on an average. So it was a good blood pressure too, decent blood pressure. This is just after one bolus. We could have done more boluses, and perhaps we could have kept them alive longer. Ringer's lactate didn't produce any change at all. They remained dead. Then we wanted to measure gases, oxygen, in these nanoparticles. And we used a method called mass spectroscopy. This is Dr. Rodriguez did this. And I don't understand all of this, but just briefly, what we did, we loaded this apparatus with our sample, our phospholipids, either saturated with oxygen or something else like nitric oxide, and then we use helium to displace the gas and detected it using a mass spectrometer. And we got a nice, it was a very, very neat way of doing it. I was very fortunate that he was right there in Little Shreveport, Louisiana, with this mass spectrometer and a novel way of measuring these gases. Doesn't look like much, but there it is. It's not a very pretty looking piece of machinery, but he had no money either. So he cobbled it together with what he had. What we got here, on the y-axis you have oxygen carrying capacity. On the x-axis you have the amount of phospholipid. And as you can see, there's a linear, each one of those points is 10 measurements. And you can see there's an increase in the oxygen carrying capacity as you increase the lipid. So we have an oxygen carrier. We also looked at nitric oxide. This is again the 10 measurements. We only measured one concentration of lipid. But what we got here on the right, you have 3.19 units versus 2.12 units. It's a 50% increase in the amount of nitric oxide that's produced. I mean, that is taken up as a result of having the phospholipids there. And what we found here, what we realized, we solved a 30-year conundrum in this area. In other words, on the left-hand side, you can see a blood vessel with nitric oxide in it. Nitric oxide is physiologically produced, and shock is overproduced. This is what causes your blood pressure to become too low. This is why we could not save that 17-year-old girl, because we had no way of addressing the overproduction of nitric oxide. Now, once it was found out that nitric oxide was the problem, scientists developed ways of blocking nitric oxide. That brought the blood pressure up, but it killed the animal, because then the blood vessels clamped down and there was no blood flow. So how do you reduce the bioavailability of nitric oxide and at the same time allow it to be present? How do you make it there and not there? And we solved this problem, I think, by using, over the other side, you see these nanoparticles. That's an electron micrograph of our nanoparticles. This is reduced size nanoparticles. And what those nanoparticles do, they will take up the nitric oxide, but using mass spectroscopy, we can show that they also release the nitric oxide. And so we have a sponge that takes it up and lets it go when it's needed. This is an experiment we did to show what would happen if we reduce the size of the nanoparticles. What we have here is 3 graphs showing the blood pressure versus time of an experiment in which rats had blood removed so that their blood pressure went down to a mean of 25 to 30. The blood pressures in rats and mice are about the same as those in humans, actually. So it was mean of 25 to 30, probably just as it would be in a patient. And we kept them there for 1 hour. And then we gave them Ringer's lactate. That's the black line in each of these graphs, okay, the lower black line. Now on the left-hand side, that's the result of, you see the upper green line, that's the result of the infusion of phospholipids that have an average diameter of 300 nanometers. You can see there's only a transient increase. In the middle, you see a red line. That's the result of giving blood, which is what you'd expect. It comes up and it stays up. We reduced the size of the nanoparticles to 94 nanometers. And that's what you see on the right-hand side, to the extreme right. You see the blue line. Unlike the graph all the way to the left, when we reduced the nanoparticles to a diameter of 94 nanometers, we had a consistent increase in the blood pressure, which acutely is no different from that of blood. We then looked at the histology of the organs. We looked at all of these organs, and we found reperfusion injury in 3 organs: the lung, the intestine, and the kidney. This is a very little complicated, but basically, Ringer's lactate's at the top, and the higher the numbers, the worse the injury. And you can see ones all the way across for Ringer's lactate. Blood was protective for intestine, but not for the other organ, not for lung, but for the kidney. And then the 300 nanometer particles were protective. You see 0.5 and 0.9. I think that's 0.94. Yeah, 0.90. They were protective for the intestine and the kidney, but not for the lung. But the reduced nanoparticle size produced extraordinary protection of the lung. We were shocked, actually. I didn't know what I was going to find. I analyzed these data a year after the experiment. I didn't think we were finding anything. I was kind of scared, actually. I thought I might find something that was contrary to what we would like. But this came out, 0.17 compared to 1.3 for Ringer's lactate, 1.0 for blood, 1.17, a dramatic production of lung, which is our primary problem clinically. So, where are we now with this product? We've seen many things. I haven't shown you all of our data, but just some of our data. We're now, our company, we formed a company, and we've developed it, we've gone through the regulatory process, we've had some conversation with the FDA. The FDA says that we can carry it through an accelerated process because everything in the product is known to be safe already. Every component is already known to be, has been studied, has been used for 40 years in patients. So here you have at the top, you go through discovery, preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then the regulatory, then you go to market. But for us, we are probably going to be, and I don't know what the FDA is finally going to do, but they've indicated to us that we can go from formulation, we've done preclinical, we can skip phase 1 and go right to phase 2. And that's what we'll be doing in a few months. We think we can get this to market in about 2 to 3 years. So this is what we're about. We're about hypovolemic shock. We've rethought hypovolemic shock. There's a lot of mythology about shock that we've gone through. This product would be good in all of these scenarios, the military and in the ER and in ambulances and so forth. We think that we are going to see a big change in what you do and what we all do. Blood is not going to be used as much as it used to be. This is not a blood substitute. I want to remind you, this is not a blood substitute. This is something that is designed for shock. Blood is not designed for shock. So right at the bottom here, in this chart, you see crystalloid, and blood crossed out. Our product, VBI-1. VBI-1. Okay, the future. We're going to replace circulating volume with fluid designed for survival. Blood is not the best option. We think we're going to make the current fluids obsolete, cell savers obsolete. It makes no sense to put blood in. We're going to have many other products, and you can see them right here. I won't go through them all, but thank you very much for your attention.
Do we have some questions for Dr. Simpkins?
Yes, Dr. Jones.
Here, hold on, Doc. We're getting your microphone. That's my job. Roger has assigned me to microphone.
You're doing a good job, Joe.
Thank you.
Tuffy, why was there an increase in the efficacy of the particle as you made it smaller?
That is the key question. We think it's because we increased the surface area of absorption of nitric oxide. That's one of the things we think happened. And I think that's probably the most important factor. We also increased the colloid pressure too because you have more particles. And so I think those are the two factors.
One other question. When it absorbs the nitric oxide and it releases it someplace else,
yes.
Is there some kind of oxygen dissociation curve that allows that to happen?
The curve would probably be, it's simply the same kind of curve on the oxygen uptake data. It's a straight line. And it's probably going to be a curve like that because it's not going to operate the way hemoglobin does with the S-shaped curves. It's going to be a straight line curve. Okay. Should I go? Any other questions? Any other questions? Okay, thank you for being here. Thanks.